Welcome everybody to another amazing episode of Roll or Die. Today we have the remarkable human being that is Georgia Verry. She's a member at our gym. She should have had her blue belt ages ago. That's why we've got her on the show. Normally we don't have white belts, but like COVID has really gotten in the way of her journey a little bit, and she's a legit blue belt wearing a white belt. She's sandbagging basically. So she's here today. Welcome to the show, and we're going to talk about all sorts of cool things, including something she has called the Fightback Project. Welcome to the show, Georgia.
Thank you so much. If it counts for anything, and my partner consistently tells me that it doesn't, I do have a black belt, just not in Jiu Jitsu. So
there we go. We'll have to talk about that. So what's that in?
So that's how I started my journey in martial arts. So very briefly, when I was 12, I started Kyokushin karate. I did that for 10 or more years, got my black belt, moved to Melbourne, needed a martial arts gym with a bigger timetable. Hence, I came to Absolute MMA with the biggest timetable ever. Yeah. And I actually got hooked into Muay Thai before I got into Jiu Jitsu. And then we'll probably talk about how my transition has been in terms of switching from professional Muay Thai fights into wearing a white belt once again, which I never thought I would do.
That's so cool.
So awesome. Georgia, you said you moved to Melbourne. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Geelong, and I grew up doing karate in Barwon Heads and Ocean Grove, so like on the coast near the beach.
Mm-hmm. What got you into the karate at 12? Like, was that just something your parents chucked you into and you were like, I don't want to do this, or was it something you chose and pulled towards you?
Kind of like that. So my mum refound her love for karate, which she had put on pause to have myself and my brother for 10 years or so. And so she went back kind of at the karate equivalent, I suppose, of about a purple belt was what she had gotten up to. And then she went back to it. And after a couple of years of watching her, I was like, can I come? And she actually made me wait until I was 12, which was what she deemed old enough to train with the adults so that I wouldn't learn bad habits from the kids. No. And so I've pretty much been getting my ass kicked since I was 12, but loving it as well.
That's awesome.
And then tell us how then that sort of transitioned into the other martial arts, into Muay Thai and then eventually Jiu Jitsu.
Yeah, so when I started at Absolute, I actually tried all of the available martial arts. So I tried Jiu Jitsu, and my initial impression was mostly my fault, but I went to an all levels class definitely before I was ready. Actually, Craig Jones was teaching it. It was at St Kilda, and I just got mauled. I was terrified. I was thinking I'm never going to grapple. It's way too scary. I'm definitely going to get injured. So I thought it'd be much safer if I stuck to striking. And from the first day of doing Muay Thai, it's very similar to Kyokushin karate, which is much like Muay Thai, except that you don't punch to the head, but you don't wear gloves. So it's a very full contact, violent style of karate. And I loved that. And, it really translated well into Muay Thai. And things just kind of escalated, Then I was sparring, then I was training in Thailand, then I was taking a modified Thai fight, which means no elbows. And then I was taking full Thai fights. And that was kind of where I got off the bus.
Wow. And what kind of mindset, because you come across, you're a mixed bag to me, because you're such a nice, generous, warm, welcoming person. And obviously there's this side to you that loves to fight. Mm-hmm. What's the motivation to fight? What was the driver behind that had you actually step in and willfully put yourself in harm's way and also be wanting to inflict harm on others? What's the driver?
I think what I always say to people is that it escalates. I can remember being 15, 16 and competing still in full contact karate, but watching Muay Thai and thinking that was never something I was going to do. And it's always gradual. And so relative to wherever you are now, it doesn't seem that violent at the time. But when you zoom out and look at the big picture, it's definitely some sort of violence, although I think a lot of people in Muay Thai would say beautiful violence, because it is very tactical and things like that. But then what would make me want to do that, I think for me, is I love competing in sport as an athlete. I love to win. I'm super competitive. And I'm actually just really terrible at any sport that involves a ball. Like if I have to throw a ball, catch a ball, I'm terrible. I really love that in striking, especially like if you aim to kick someone in the leg and you kick their hip, or, you know, like a human's a pretty big target relative to catching a ball. And that seemed to align more with my level of
a big
coordination.
Wonky ball, a big wonky hit anywhere ball.
Yeah.
And Georgia, you kind of skipped over a bit your Muay Thai fighting and your Muay Thai records. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because you are pretty accomplished. Like, no need for humbleness here. Like, tell us what happened.
Yeah. So I've had 5 professional fights and my record is 3-2. Yeah, I have 1 win by TKO stoppage through clinch knees. So anyone who trains with me in jiu-jitsu knows I love to clinch. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I think like it was something that I could have continued with and taken to a high level. I was kind of getting ready to fight for a belt, although I had a couple of losses, which I would have had to build back up for. But I guess we can talk now into the weight cutting side of the sport is really the thing that was the main thing that ended my career there, as well as the concern about traumatic brain injury. But for me, the biggest thing was how detrimental it was for my mental and physical health to go through weight cuts and weigh-ins.
Totally. Yeah. So was it you who first noticed that degradation in mental health, or was it like, were people kind of having an intervention with you and saying, hey, Georgia, you know, are you sure you're okay doing this? Or were you going, oh my God, I'm not fucking okay doing this. I've got to make some changes. How did that come about?
It was a little bit of both. So my partner, Patrick, didn't want to be the person who said, you know, you probably need to stop this and saying you need to stop this at some point. And of course, he's very biased, giving, you know, that he does jiu-jitsu. But it was when I went to Bali, or we went to Bali together to go and train at Bali MMA. And I took my Muay Thai gear and I took my gis. And at that point, I had been doing like a little bit of jiu-jitsu kind of on the side in between fights. But every time I had taken a fight, you know, you go into a full-time fight camp. So it had been very sporadic. And then after it was my 5th fight, which the weight cut for that, I think was the thing that made me realize, accompanied with him kind of hinting at things. So I walk around now at a healthy weight of 65 kilos for my size. And I don't think numbers are that important, but for the context of kind of painting a picture, I was fighting at 53.5 kilos. Wow. So part of that was a water cut. And so I would on a Monday be 57 kilos and lose 3.5 kilos in water through a dehydration process, which is bad in of itself. But really, like 3.5 kilos is a lot to lose. And it meant that like on that Friday, when you do the weigh-in, I was in a very, very distressed, like I didn't think I was going to make the weight kind of state. You know, Pat was kind of worried that we were going to have to go to hospital. Like that's really how close it gets. And the reason was that every time I was weight cutting, it was getting harder for me to lose like the fat leading up to that week as well too. So if I'm saying like I started at 57 kilos, well, a couple of fights before that, I was starting the cut at 56. And every time that I trashed my body by eating like no carbs and training, you know, hours a day, I think it got a little bit harder and harder until it got to a point where I realized that like it wasn't a sustainable thing. Wow. And so that combined with, I had amenorrhea, which is a loss of your menstrual cycle for 3.5 years at the point where I decided to put the weight on. And I started to think, because initially I was thinking like, this is awesome, right? Like I don't have to deal with having a bleed. I don't have to deal with the pain, the emotion. I'm like a boy. This is amazing. And I started to realize that my gut health, my moods, even though I thought I wasn't having the emotional swings, my sleep, my immunity, like my ability to not get sick was all being super compromised. And at some point, I think myself and Pat really together, we sat down and we were like, is it because you're not a proper woman? Like, you're not ovulating. Are you not honoring your body to the point where all these other things are happening? And so that was the point where I just stopped training Muay Thai, took myself out of the temptation to accept another fight, trained Jiu Jitsu full-time in Bali, put on like 7 kilos and got much healthier. My period came back pretty much instantly, which I'm quite lucky about.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's kind of where I got to being obsessed with jiu-jitsu. And then of course being really competitive would made me, want to train a lot and want to get straight into competing and things like that, because I love training when you have a competition or a fight or something like that to prep for.
So you still get this taste. You still get the taste of the addiction of competing, but now your body's in a healthier state. So it's kind of like replacing one drug with another drug, a much healthier drug if you want,
Yeah, people talk about that a lot in martial arts. So yes.
I love it.
And that sort of weight cut, Georgia, is that pretty common in Muay Thai? Like, 12 or so kilos to lose or was that out of the ordinary?
It's not that it's 12 kilos to lose, because you maintain a walking around weight consistently. That is probably lower than, well, it's not necessarily lower than, different people have different body types and things like that, but you tend to maintain a low body weight. But it's super common. It's absolutely the norm that everyone is trying to be as lean as possible, to be in the lowest weight class possible. And for women, unfortunately, part of that's due to availability. The majority of the fighters in the female divisions are 53.5 and 57 kilos. And so if you're heavier than that, it's just a long time in between fights, like waiting to get a match. But also everybody thinks that they need the reach advantage, the weight advantage over their opponent, because if they don't do it, then their opponent's going to be cutting weight from so much higher, and they're going to be outmatched. And really, like, there's nothing stopping me from taking a fight at my weight, but the girl that I would be fighting would be huge and punching me. It's very different to, I think, going in like an open weight in jiu-jitsu, where you can, use leverage and all these other different things, that it's a bit, I feel like it's more manageable to fight a bigger opponent.
So what, like if I said to you, hey, I'm putting on a fight on a competition next week, and it's going to be all girls who haven't cut any weight, your level of skill, your weight, would you do that? Would you be interested in that?
Yeah, I would love it.
Yeah. So like there must be room, there must be a market for that. I'm thinking is like, if organizers can tap into that and like make it a rule that you can't cut, you have to come in at your walking around weight. You have to show that here's your card of weighing in for the last 12 months. Every month you've maintained your weight, your walking around weight. Like, surely, is there any talk of any of that sort of shit at all? Is there no talk of that?
No, I mean, it's hard enough to put on fights at the moment generally, given COVID. But before COVID, I hadn't heard any talk of anything like that. And, there are federations like one where they do dehydration tests. But the problem is, I think that like people would maintain a super low body fat for 12 months. Like people are always trying to find a way around something like that. And to create that big of an honesty system is, I think, more difficult than we can even imagine. Like, I would love it. It would be ideal. Hopefully that'll exist in the future. And at the amateur level, that's kind of what happens. Although people even take, I think, amateur fights way too seriously. And so who knows? Who knows? I would love that though.
Yeah.
So do you miss Muay Thai? Do you ever dabble in it anymore, or you've cut all ties?
I haven't cut all ties. So I feel like I really get an awesome fix of Muay Thai through my work. So I run a trauma-informed kickboxing program for women. And at the moment it's completely online, but I do in-person and online classes. And in that, I'm teaching kickboxing, and I'm teaching it in such a different way that really makes me feel good and strong and connected to my body. And I think that for me, kickboxing has now kind of become my like mindfulness meditation part of my martial arts practice, even though I'm teaching. Like I get so much out of teaching those classes. So for me, that's really filling my need at the moment for doing Muay Thai. I think when we open up, if I could fit in a couple of classes per week. But again, like I've alluded to, I get a little bit obsessive, and I think, you know, the nationals will come up, gradings will be on, and I get too, like, it's too hard to focus on too many sports at once. So I'm super grateful that I have the opportunity to teach Muay Thai and still have it in my life in that way.
Yeah. Can you talk about trauma informed? Most people wouldn't know what that even means. So what is the definition of trauma informed?
Okay, so to define trauma informed, we probably need to talk about what is trauma, particularly in that context, because I think a lot of people assume trauma is like a scary event or a series of events or a set of circumstances, but it's a little bit more than that. That's part of it. But you could have a scary event or a full-on circumstance or something and not experience that as traumatic. So trauma is all about the way that you as a body and really especially how your nervous system responded to an event or a series of events that at the time you deemed to be threatening, that at the time overwhelmed your ability to cope with that stress, and therefore led to an adverse impact on your well-being, whether that be your psychological, emotional, physical, spiritual, any type of well-being in the future. So we really talk about how the body responded to some kind of an event and how that traumatic event becomes stored in the body, kind of like something that's stuck and trying to get out. So that's trauma. And then trauma informed really looks at some of the key concepts of how can we create safety for all people. So for me, I actually brought some stats in for you guys about Jiu Jitsu that is part of research that I conducted, because I think people kind of have a handle on why this might be important and how to apply it and things like that, but maybe haven't thought about it in as much detail. So, okay, I've got notes here. So I surveyed 147 people that did Brazilian Jiu Jitsu specifically. Now, my study looked at more people than that, but if I break it down just into the people who did Jiu Jitsu, 61.64% of those people said that they currently experience anxiety or depression.
Wow.
It's high, right? So if you contrast that to the number of Australians that say that they experience anxiety or depression, it's hard to get a clear stat, but it's approximately 20%. At least in 2018, it was about 20% of Australians said they had any mental or behavioural disorder at that moment in time. So it's way higher.
Wow.
So sorry to interrupt, Georgia. When did you do this study? Because I know just in my general interactions with people after, since COVID, I think it would be much higher than 20% of the general population right now.
Right now, for sure. And it's that's why I say it's difficult to compare to. But this study was done right at the start of COVID. So again, could be a confounding factor as well, for sure. Yeah. Okay. And I'm kind of patiently waiting to see what the new statistics are for mental health as a response to the pandemic and what people are calling the shadow pandemic, as in the mental health burden that's come from all of the negative things that have come with it. That said, I do think there is a disproportionately higher percentage of people that experience any kind of mental distress in combat sports. And my research and other research points to that as, okay, the initial thing. So you're thinking like, well, but I feel like martial arts have been so transformative for me. They're so good for me. Like, how can that possibly be? And so even if you look at my study, and I think it's useful to look within the study, if you break it down, people who have been doing jiu-jitsu for 1 year or less, 5 years or less, 72% of those, so much higher, said they experienced anxiety or depression. Whereas people who have been doing jiu-jitsu for over 10 years, it's like 52%. Even those who've been doing jiu-jitsu for over 5 years, 55%. I would say that's not a statistically significant difference. So it's kind of like you get past your purple belt, there's a huge improvement in your mental health. It's like if you've stuck at it. Now, that's a correlation. You can't say it's because of jiu-jitsu. You might also say, well, the people who had less anxiety, they're the ones that stuck around. So we need much more research in this space. But I think anecdotally, if you speak to people, a lot of people have accounts of how, you know, BJJ saved their life. Like I've got a whole podcast about it. I've had heaps of people tell me about it. It's constant. It's the whole motivation for why I was thinking, you know, what kind of work can we do that's direct in this mental health care space?
Yeah.
So in highlighting like, well, what's a trauma-informed model and why is it so important? And like, why should everyone in jiu-jitsu care about it so much? My like big soapbox thing is to say that the majority of people in clubs aren't there to compete. Like if you look at the percentage of people on the mats who compete relative to the total number of people on the mats, it's the minority. It's not the majority. And so then you think, well, why are people there? And a lot of the time it's for the community, you know, it's for the gains in confidence. It's for all of these things that have huge beneficial impacts on their mental health. And I think when you're teaching a general population as opposed to an athletic population, especially, but I also do think that this kind of lens is appropriate in the athletic population. It, to me, is very important to consider who might be in the room, how they're interpreting what you're saying, and whether they feel like they have a sense of safety. And so that is what trauma-informed is. It's thinking, okay, how might someone take what I say? How does my language affect somebody's nervous system? And if they have a response, if they freeze or they go into like a fight or flight, they want to run away, or their body tenses up and they want to fight, or they just kind of drop and become either motionless or detached from their body. If that happens to me in a martial arts class, which happens quite commonly, because like I've said, a lot of people who have experienced trauma and who are having a hard time with their mental health, I think are drawn to martial arts. Then how do you respond to that? And before that's even happened, are there things that you can do that are going to make sure that happens less? Sorry, my camera just froze.
So while you're getting your camera working out, so what you're saying is if you're a trauma-informed deliverer of a service, what that means is you are informed in how to work with people who have experienced trauma to make sure that they feel safe.
Totally.
Okay, got it.
And it's easier than I think people might think, you know, like there's a big continuum of what is a trauma-informed program, like what's a therapeutic program versus what's trauma-informed. Like my program is a therapeutic program, so it looks very different to a traditional kickboxing program. But to be trauma-informed, you might just have exits readily, you know, accessible. You might consider that making sure that nobody in your class like just slaps anybody back in response to having their hands down. That's like a kickboxing specific example, because somebody might not like that, you know, or you bring the one thing that I think is really, really underdone is bringing consent into training opportunities more frequently. So at the beginning of every roll, having an explicit conversation that says, this is how hard I want to roll today, 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%. And if there's a mismatch, I'm not feeling great today, I would like to roll at 50% intensity. I would like to roll at 100% intensity. Okay, let's find new training partners because we're not going to give each other what we need right now. Or you're the higher belt, the other person says they want to do less, or whatever, the other person says they want to do less, looking at that from the perspective of, well, what do I gain from a 50% intensity roll? And the answer is heaps, right? It doesn't need to be pour harder all the time for you to benefit. No. And if the other person wants to go 50% and you're going 100%, well, you gain absolutely nothing. You would have got more from going 50%. So bringing explicit consent into the space as a way to create safety not only reduces the likelihood that somebody's going to get triggered, but it also means that you and your training partner get more out of your training. And this is the kind of thing that I think like we can push more in the coaching space is like, okay, we know how to make people win jiu-jitsu matches, but how can we make sure that everybody walks away from the training experience feeling like they got what they're there for? And it's not always about, you know, being a better fighter.
Yeah.
Have you got any suggestions for, let's say, other white belt females to have that conversation Like, I know from my experience, when I was a white belt, I don't think I would have been confident to have that sort of conversation at the start with, say a male
I think this
about
applies to
the
males
intensity.
too. Like I remember
Yeah.
just being so nervous to go into the gym for the first year. I'd sit in
Yeah.
my car every day and go, should I go in today or should I not go in today? I could just drive home right now. Maybe I should just drive home. That conversation would happen and eventually I'd work up the courage to go in. So it definitely.
That anxiety, those anxiety statistics you talked about, I mean, probably many people doing jiu-jitsu have those often before class, there's anxiety about going just in general to class. So yeah, like how can people feel confident in themselves to have that conversation, or what sort of tips would you suggest, male or female?
Male or female, I think beyond the culture of the club, which I think is a really, really important thing. And so I suppose at an individual level, if your club is the kind of club where if you try and have that conversation with people and you're noticing that like every higher belt you try and have that conversation with dismisses you, I would talk to the coach about it. And if there's no cultural change, I would leave that club. There are so many clubs. You will find one that's going to be really inclusive of you speaking up and respectful of you for doing that, because it is a scary thing to do. But beyond that, I think something that's really, really valuable is actually practice of what I call rejection therapy. There's a TED talk about this and I think it's excellent. And I really do recommend like everyone at some point in their life try doing this, which is go up to strangers. Again, it's kind of difficult at the moment with COVID, but go and ask people crazy things that you know they're going to say no to. Because the thing is that if you're feeling anxiety around asking someone if they will roll light with you, your anxiety is around them maybe making fun of you, or it's around them saying no. Because if they say yes, cool, you got what they want. If they say no, then you want to learn how to have your nervous system not respond to that in a big physiological spike, like not to get really stressed and overwhelmed if someone says no. Just go, okay, we won't roll together. That's fine. I'm going to go on to the next person. And if there's no other training partners, then I'm going to sit out because I spoke my need to you and you just rejected it. That's on you. That's scary though. And so I think getting practice with asking for things is really, really useful. And it has lots of applications on and off the mat. So like the first thing that you can try is to go up to a stranger and say, hi, can I please have $50? They're going to say no. And they're going to say no. So it's great because, you're waiting for them to say no, but it's like uncomfortable, right? And then you can try lots of different things like that. Like when I first did it, I was going into fast food places and asking like if I could get a refill on my burger for free. I was going into Safeway, like to Woolworths, and asking, could I go and make a voiceover over the PA system at the supermarket? Just like crazy things that I knew people were definitely going to say no to. Yeah. And at the time I had a sales job as well, which I think is really useful if you ever want to build your confidence, is work in sales and get rejected all the time. But you don't have to work in sales. Like I say, you can go out and do rejection therapy until you get to the point where in your body there's going to be a little bit of like a heart rate goes up when you're asking the scary thing, but it's not this overwhelming thing because you've had practice at it. It's a muscle. You've got to flex it.
That's beautiful. So that's the anti-fragile concept you're talking about there, right? Is that what you're talking about?
It's kind of like that. Yeah. It's awesome. Like anti-fragile.
I wonder, so it's called the Fightback Project, right? That's your kickboxing, trauma-informed stuff. So how do people find you? How do they is it all word of mouth? Do people who are experiencing trauma tend to hang around with other people who are experiencing trauma, and therefore, or because 60% of us are dealing with anxiety and depression, is it just something that spreads, or do people Google you and find you? How do people find you?
It's about 50-50 between Google and psychologist referrals or other mental health services referrals. So almost exclusively. I'm not to say that people who have experienced trauma don't hang out with other people who have experienced trauma. They probably do, because the statistics like in Australia are just so high. So even if they don't know it, they probably do. But it's less by personal referral, because I think there's a lot of shame around having experienced domestic violence. For example, people don't tend to be like, oh, I experienced domestic violence and I went and did this program and like you should do it too. Although that can happen, it's much more, they've Googled like self-defense for females who have experienced domestic violence or other kind of similar search terms. Some people are looking specifically for trauma-informed martial arts services, although that's quite rare because it's such a new concept. It doesn't really exist. And then I practice out of a clinic in South Melbourne, and I'm just going to start in a new clinic when we open up in Surrey Hills as well. So I get referrals from the clinics that I work in a lot, and then also from other clinicians nearby that I have relationships with or that have looked into it. And yeah, that's how people would normally come to a program like that.
Brilliant.
Okay. We haven't really talked much at all about your jiu-jitsu, but I guess it is a jiu-jitsu podcast, so we have to just venture a little bit into that. So you touched on it before, but can you tell us in a little bit more detail how you made the decision to do that switch over from striking, and how you found jiu-jitsu so far? So as Anton said, we were originally planning to have you on after you grade to blue, and then potentially ask the questions around like the change, because from my experience, and perhaps others that listening could also attest, unfortunately it is a little bit harder once you get the blue. People are not as nice to you when you're rolling. So yeah, I was
more
looking
traumatic
to go down that path. Yes, it's much more traumatic as a blue belt.
Well, then I'm looking forward to that when we come back to training. So I started jiu-jitsu because I was at the Christmas party at our club and I met Doug. So Doug Kaigi, who was at the time a brown belt, and he was like, "Hi, I'm a brown belt with a broken back." And I was like, "Oh, I work in clinical back pain. I'm interested in jiu-jitsu. You want to do a swap?" And so he started working in strength training to the point where his back was like, good enough that he went to like Worlds, which was amazing. And he started teaching me in privates. And that was how I got originally past the, like I said, I got really scared that jiu-jitsu was just an injury factory. I got past that.
But you were already a member at Absolute training in striking at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. And then started with him a little bit, was like, oh, this is like pretty cool. But at the same time, every time I would get a bit excited about jiu-jitsu, Tui, who's the head Muay Thai coach, would be like, oh, we're going to have another fight. And so it was this really funny like back and forth between Tiago and Tui for a little while, being like, she's going to do jiu-jitsu, she's going to do Muay Thai.
Oh,
yeah, totally, completely.
Seeing that other coach again.
Yeah. And then, like I said, the transition into jiu-jitsu when I was in Bali. And then after that, I guess COVID happened. And then I broke my collarbone like real early on in jiu-jitsu. Like I got to face adversity before I knew most of the syllabus. So that was a fun 2-3 months, as Kim's very familiar with, and kind of like getting over, I guess, the fear of being taken down and hurting it again, which for me was just like noticing the fear and doing it anyway until it got to a point where I wasn't scared. Yeah, it was a takedown.
Okay. What kind of takedown?
It was like a trip. I don't know what you would call this kind of a trip.
Where you get dragged your shoulder into the ground.
Yeah, but where like my sleeve was pulled across, so the sleeve that was pulled across, that was the side that I landed on. Super fun. And yeah, but what it meant was that it was kind of interesting. Like I was really into playing spider guard when I first started. That was the first thing that Doug taught me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be like a guard player, which made zero sense because like I had come from striking and part of me was thinking, would I ever do MMA? Here I am just like learning spider guard, completely useless. But breaking my collarbone meant that I couldn't play guard anymore. I had to play top position. And so I got really into Romulo Barral, who is the spider guard guy. His knee cut passing series, and he had all these like amazing details, and like I could do knee cut passing because there was no pressure on my arm. So I got really into passing for a while, and now I think I definitely prefer a top game to a bottom game, and it's probably because I spent more time on top due to my comfort. And yeah, then like I said, I've been super interested in competing always. So when the VIX came up, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do the VIX. the VIX was super interesting. It was my second jiu-jitsu competition. My first jiu-jitsu competition was like a white belt round robin, and I got smashed. I think I got Kimura'd like in 30 seconds, and then I lost on points because I didn't know how to do a scissor sweep, and I just like needed to open my closed guard and sweep at the last second to get points back. I can do scissor sweep now, so it's all good.
So you know.
And then, the nationals, at the VIX, my first match, I lost like pretty much straight away. I got triangled because I was so nervous. I just like put myself back into a triangle. And then once my nerves had shaken out a bit, I went in the open weight. Like I said, in jiu-jitsu, it's pretty epic because you can fight in open weight categories, and got a few wins and ended up coming second in the absolute in gi. And then the next day won no gi. So I was like, I could deal with jiu-jitsu competing. And that was the point where Tiago was like, okay, we need to grade you. And I was like, okay, yep, fair enough. Started studying the syllabus, and I mean, a lot of that's been in and out of lockdown. So whenever anyone asks me how long I've been doing jiu-jitsu, I just do not know what to say. I don't feel like it's the sum of the actual amount of time, because I spent so much time watching and thinking and doing and being around training. I find it the hardest thing to answer when anyone's like, well, how long have you been doing this for? I just usually say a while.
Yeah, that's great. We only have 3 minutes left. So you are a fellow podcaster just like us. We can call ourselves podcasters now. We've got to you're episode 81, I think. So we're doing pretty well for ourselves. Just want to find out, or for our listeners to find out a bit, you are hyper intelligent. You're obviously really caring about the community, about people's growth and development, and how they can be happier in the world. So what is the podcast about? Because if they want to get over and follow you, and where can they find you? Or maybe we can put that link in our post. We'll put a link over to yours, but what is your podcast about?
So the podcast is called the Fightback Podcast, and it's about stories of how, especially women, but I have had a couple of men on, have overcome hardship through martial arts. So they've had maybe a tough upbringing, or they've experienced domestic violence, and that's been either during or before they started martial arts, and how they overcame, like we spoke about, like that real big white belt anxiety, coupled with the fact that they're not sure how their nervous system and their body is going to respond, and sort of where they've gotten to now. And it's really set up to be an inspiring series for the women that I work with. And I think all women who are interested in getting into martial arts, and all people who are interested in the martial arts and mental health side. And then I also have experts in this field who come on and talk about programs of theirs, which are similar but different to the Fightback Project, and other researchers who are looking into the links between martial arts and mental health. So it's a really fun podcast. It's on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, the usual places.
We're all the good stuff. So, all right,
you are so professional. Look at your setup, man.
Anton, we got a lot to learn.
80, and we're still just doing it like this. But
the Georgia Verry School of Podcasting. Georgia Verry, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. You are a breath of fresh air in this world, and I can't wait to see you with that blue strapped around your waist.
Yeah, let's see you on the mat soon. Let's hope just a little bit longer. We can
just a little bit longer.
Roll again.
Let's do it.
Thank you, everybody. And take care. So we'll be sharing this in about a week or so, and if you could do the same, that would be awesome. It would really help our audience.
Yes, I'll pop it on all my platforms.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay. See ya.
Bye.